What's going on, Summoners? Welcome back to another Wild Rift video. My name is Kangas, and today I'm covering our updated champion tier list for patch 2.1 after the February 5th hotfix. This tier list is a generalized one for the Wild Rift, covering all levels of play. There's still a lack of data available right now, so we can't make adjusted tier lists for specific levels of play, but this should be accurate for all elos and cover every player. Now let's get into it.
You'll notice that not much has changed over the course of patch 2.1 for the Baron lane, and only Lulu and Orianna were affected by the hotfix. Our prediction for how the patch would play out were largely correct, and champion strength assessments were pretty accurate. Still, we're going to go over some of the dominant champions in the Baron lane and why they're so powerful. First off, you guessed it, Olaf is still incredibly dominant in the Baron lane and is one of the strongest champions on the patch. You're pretty much guaranteed a topside advantage if you pick the Berserker, and every skirmish you take should result in a victory. His Undertow allows him to safely farm and harass in ranged matchups, and the chain slows also help him run down any pesky Baron laners that most champions can't chase. His sustain from vicious strikes is also unmatched in early game fights, and the raw power in his kit means that he can outmuscle pretty much every Baron laner in duels, and can translate this lead into either helping his jungler out or potentially 1v2ing. With so much access to golden experience, Olaf doesn't really get outscaled until far too late into the game, and he can take over teamfights very easily, rampaging through entire enemy backlines. Darius, similarly to Olaf, is extraordinarily powerful in the early game and has the damage to chew through any Baron laner in mere seconds. Once you fully stack Darius' passive, the bonus attack damage and instant full passive application makes him genuinely terrifying to be fighting against. Darius has the raw damage to actually melt through champions like Malphite, Gragas, and yes, Olaf, which are quite popular Baron lanes right now, and most of them are really hard to take down. Darius doesn't have as much raw power as Olaf in the 1v1 and is also way weaker against ranged matchups than Olaf is. However, Darius has insane pop-off potential and can rip through entire teams once his passive is stacked up. He also just has generally more skill expression if you're really good at him. When Darius has 5 stacks, he can flash in and decimate their entire team, chopping them all down with the Enoxian Guillotine. Not many champions possess the multi-kill potential of Darius, and when combined with his powerful early game, he makes for a fearsome carry Baron laner. We haven't spoken too much about Wukong lately, but he's actually settling onto the Wild Rift as a pretty powerful Baron laner. Wukong's passive Crushing Blows makes his extended trades against most Baron laners really powerful. Olaf and Darius will tend to melt through his health bar, but most other Baron laners will succumb to the increased damage. Meanwhile, Wukong's Golden Staff gives him excellent sustain and a good chunk of harass in lane. So even if you're not headbutting the enemy Baron laner, you can play the resource game and remain out of their range. Meanwhile, Wukong's Warrior Trickster is one of the best abilities for outplaying enemies. You can use the small dash and invisibility to dodge skill shots, however you can also easily deceive enemy champions with it. You can stand still and pretend to have used it, or use it to gap close from Fog of War. There's a lot of potential trickery with this ability, and wise use of it will help you gain the edge over your opponents on the Wild Rift. Wukong is also a potent team fighter, with multiple knockups from Cyclone providing tons of crowd control and disruption for your team. So here's our updated champion tier list for the Baron lane. Before we move on, make sure to join our Wild Rift Discord in the description below and sub to the channel to keep updated on all things related to Wild Rift. We love making content for you guys, and we love your interaction, so join us on Discord, comment down below, and let's get back to the video. We've already talked about Olaf in the Baron lane, but in the jungle, he's finally ascended into the OP tier. He's honestly kind of broken, and you should be abusing him in any game that you can get your hands on him. Olaf's Undertow and Vicious Strikes combined with his passive give him an incredibly speedy clear, and he absolutely flies through the jungle right now. His early game dueling is also excellent, and most junglers just don't possess the burst to completely one-shot him or have enough consistent damage to burn through his sustain when he's low. He's also excellent at taking objectives, and while he doesn't have the best crowd control for ganks, he does have a nice slow on his Undertow, and if an enemy is overextended, they will most likely die. He also makes up for his lack of ganking prowess with the fact that he wins virtually any fight he opts into, so he's extremely scary to jungle against. Olaf is just too strong right now, and if you want to be able to dominate the Wild Rift, you need to give him a try. Amumu's position on the tier list has not been updated, however, he's still proving to be a powerful utility jungler with surprisingly high damage. Between his passive, Curse Touch, Tantrum, and Despair, his damage output is quite high, and while he can't duel champions like Shyvana and Olaf, he will still wipe out health bars of carries and tanks with ease. He can also use these abilities to speed through the jungle. Level 5 is when Amumu really comes online as he gains access to his high impact ultimate, Curse of the Sad Mummy. Amumu's ganks in the early game are fairly decent, with Bandage Toss being a great gap closer as well as crowd control, but if he's counter-ganked, it's likely that he just loses. But when he has his ultimate, he is devastating. He can use it to lock up entire teams or extend the crowd control on the single person that he's ganking. While Amumu might not be the flashiest of junglers, he is extremely effective and relatively easy to play. Jax is one of the few champions that has moved up a tier, going from C up to B. And while he's not an insane jungler, when he gets ahead, he can definitely carry games and also has some useful tools in the early game. Jax's clear isn't the fastest, but he can combine Leap Strike with Counter Strike to create some pretty threatening ganks. His damage is also quite high, so he's good at killing targets with his team, but in the early game, he can still get bursted down. Jax is one of the most potent carry champions when he gets ahead, as his spike on completion of Trinity Force is just incredible, and when he can't burst down Jax, he will slowly tear through your team. Don't expect to go winning any matchups against Olaf or Lee Sin though, but if you do enjoy Jax in the jungle, he's still playable for now. So here's our updated champion tier list for the jungle. Before we get into the rest of the video, our question of the day is, what's your favorite ability in the game? I've just accepted at this point that I'm slowly turning into Braum, so mine's gotta be Unbreakable. Since I'm a support main, I play against a lot of AD carries, and there's nothing as satisfying as just blocking all of their damage from one direction, especially if it's timed well enough to stop something like a Draven ult or a Xayah ult. But let me know yours in the comments down below. Orianna received a hotfix nerf earlier in the month, with her ultimate cooldown being increased in the early stages of the game. Orianna is extremely dominant right now, and her low cooldown shockwave was making it really hard for enemy champions to find windows to fight her. However, she still remains very OP, as her shockwave cooldown is still low enough to be relevant in the early game, and her potent laning phase and strong team fighting are still definitely there. Her harass is brutal, and she can make the laning phase extremely unpleasant for whoever has to face her. Command Dissonance allows her to speed herself up to avoid ganks, and she's just generally hard to punish. She combines well with the strong bruisers in the Baron lane, setting them up with extra shields and speed, and potentially a devastating shockwave to follow up on their engage. Overall, she's basically the same as she was before, and if you are abusing her to climb the ladder, just keep doing it. Corki, meanwhile, has been moved down from the S tier to the A tier. We realized our initial placement for Corki was a little too high, and while he's still quite powerful, Orianna has far more impact over the game than he does. Meanwhile, Akali and Zed tend to have extreme kill threat on him. To survive assassin lanes, Corki must play safe, but he can still farm with Phosphorus Bomb and Missile Barrage. Combined with the safety from Valkyrie, Corki can navigate these scary laning phases without losing too much, but on the Wild Rift, conceding lane is never ideal. And because Corki is on the back foot in most of these matches, Akali and Zed get to run the Rift, and you have to rely on your team playing well to not die. If you do get to Corki's powerful mid and late game spikes, he is an excellent source of DPS, and a well-placed package can wipe out an entire team. Corki's still a great mid laner, but no longer deserves his place in the S tier. Aurelion Sol, meanwhile, has shown a large presence in some of the initial competitive tournaments that have been played out recently, and for good reason. He's not the most powerful laner, however, he can shove the wave out really quickly and influence the map quite easily. Comment of Legend allows him to traverse great distances very fast, and when he arrives with Star Surge, if the enemy team can't dodge it, they are for sure dead. He's no slouch in teamfights either, and can put out great damage with the Celestial Expansion and Voice of Light. His matchup against assassins and most melee mids are pretty poor, and he can get punished when isolated in the 1v1. But Aurelion Sol can also opt into one-shotting waves and roaming around with his jungler instead. When paired up with his jungler, he's really strong and can arrive in fights fast and has crowd control and burst to help eliminate targets. So here's our updated champion tier list for the mid lane. Jinx has become one of the strongest marksmen on the patch, and while she isn't in the OP tier, she's still really powerful at all stages of the game, and can hard carry fights later on. Jinx's laning phase may initially seem weak, but if she lands a zap, her damage is really high, and she can use the extra range from her rockets to harass without potential of the enemy trading back. Her Flame Choppers also do great damage and are excellent follow-up CC to your support's engage, and Super Mega Death Rocket is usually enough to burst through those low enemy health bars. Jinx's pairing with Lulu in particular is insane, as she becomes extremely fast and hard to kill. Her damage is unmatched in the right situations, and if enemies stack up for her rockets, she will shred through them with crits. Jinx also matches up particularly nice into Kai'Sa and can often dominate her in lane if played well. Since her release, Xayah has shaped up to be a solid A-tier carry, and her damage output when enemies are running into her is extremely powerful. Her strong defensive ultimate allows her to play out teamfights against assassins in particular. Where other marksmen may die, Xayah can live to DPS for the entire fight. When paired with Rakan, Xayah is definitely an S-tier marksman. The extra aggressive potential when the duo is united turns them from simply scaling teamfights into a scary Dragon Lane combo, and they'll be able to build advantages from powerful laning, which translates nicely into later game fights. Xayah's build path is somewhat awkward as she likes ability haste, but has no good way to attain it currently. She's still really strong though, and if you want to never die to an assassin or Malphite ult again, Xayah is definitely your champ. Unfortunately, one of my favorite AD carries, Jhin, has dropped from the S tier into the A tier. While he still has strong laning, his damage in the mid and later game is fairly underwhelming compared to the other meta marksmen. He can still combo well with his support for some nice early kills, but if he's not snowballing, he's not that useful. Misfortune and Kai'Sa are much better at dominating lane, and most other marksmen will deal more damage in teamfights. He's still good, but far from where he used to be. So here's our updated champion tier list for AD carries. When it comes to support, Alistar and Lulu are your king and queen. These two unique champions have very different strengths and each thrive in specific scenarios. You want to buff up one of your OP carries like Kai'Sa or Misfortune? Well, Lulu's your gal. Her incredible shielding and peel tools coupled with her strong laning from her ranged harass make her a deadly foe in and out of the lane phase. Lulu is squishy, but her mobility and utility means that if you position well, the reward is massive. The nerf to her base stats and ultimate cooldown honestly didn't affect her much, and she's still top tier. When picking Lulu, you want to watch out for champions like Blitzcrank and Lux that can both single you out from long range. Pick Lulu in spots where your opponent needs to dive forward to engage onto you. By shielding your priority targets and slowing your opponents, you will be able to effectively kite backwards and win any fight. But if Lulu is the shield, then consider Alistar the sword. This champion has one of the strongest level 3 power spikes in the entire game, and you'll be consistently shocked at how much all-in power your CC heavy kit possesses. Alistar thrives in situations where you can go forward and set up your team to unload damage on the stun targets. His strong AoE means that he is a force to be reckoned with in any group situation, carrying skirmishes and teamfights through strong engages and tanking damage. Alistar is at the top of our list for supports because he pairs incredibly well with Kai'Sa and Misfortune, who are both lane dominant champions when paired with engaged supports. Your CC helps stack Kai'Sa's passive, and Misfortune's Make It Rain helps set you up to land an easy combo. Look to pick Alistar when you're faced up against immobile carry champions like Orianna, Twisted Fate, Ashe, and Jhin. Rakan is regularly a B tier support, but when paired with Xayah, he moves up to the A tier. His laning phase is relatively weak on his own, with low damage, mediocre crowd control, small shields, and honestly not much else. He's really squishy and can't really fight many of the other supports. His engaged potential outside of lane phase though is insane, and he can find really good fights for his team. But on the Wild Rift, early game is still really important, so conceding an entire dual lane is suboptimal. But like I said, when paired with Xayah, his early game becomes far more powerful, as he's given extra mobility and damage to play around with. If you're picking him, try and do it with Xayah, otherwise it's probably better to find a different support like Alistar to engage with. So here's our updated champion tier list for supports.
Honestly, not much changed over the course of this patch, and most champions just moved up or down maybe one tier. It's been a fairly stable patch, but there was no huge mid-patch update, so that's kind of to be expected. Anyway, thanks for watching. Make sure to answer our question of the day in the comments down below. Also, we've been discussing it internally, and we can't really decide. If I'm Braum and Avalon is Lux, what does that make to you? I know you'd probably look at her and say Kai'Sa, but between us, I think she's more of a Teemo, if you know what I mean. Anyway, everybody, remember to like the video, sub to the channel, and as always, best of luck on the Rift. Stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time. What if I did the whole thing with this accent? What's up, summoners? Welcome back to another Wild Rift video. Today, we're talking about the dangers of chewing tobacco. Okay.